can mute themselves. And then there'll be the ability to ask questions either by raising your hand at the end, or you can populate the chats with some questions as we go along. But we'll take all the questions at the end of the talks. And just to flag that if you can keep your talks or your questions more general in context in terms of the overall approvals process rather than specifically related to individual projects, that'd be good. So it's not a open session, but more of a general overview. Take it away. Thank you.
I'm Philip Diamond, and I'm going to talk about how to secure approvals for your research, but I'm going to first start off with the purpose of research governance. Research governance is to support and facilitate researchers to undertake high-quality research and to ensure that the interests of participants, researchers, and the trusts are protected through their compliance to local and national regulations. Most R&D offices around the country are joint departments with their associated academic partners, in which our case would be Institute of Child Health, part of UCL. But both institutions have different local requirements to navigate for governance. So during our reviews, this may require different pathways to be completed. The types of studies we would normally review would be commercial, non-commercial, hosted, sponsored. This could also include research within labs or collection of data sets and case note reviews. Ooh, sorry, I didn't cross. So, tasked with protecting patients, staff, and the trust while carrying out research, we set standards to improve research quality and safeguarding, but it also involves promoting good practice. We advise researchers and other stakeholders about local practices. We also include external sponsors in how we do things locally. We also ensure lessons are learned so that adverse events incidences are reduced and to prevent poor performance and misconduct issues within the research settings. We arrange honorary contracts and research passports for external staff to assist with studies by carrying out appropriate checks and engaging in carrying out monitoring and auditing of studies to check their quality and compliance. So by working with our contracts and finance teams, we ensure that appropriate agreements related to the study are in place and that budget reviews are completed. That safeguards the trust resources, for example. These reviews would ensure legal and financial responsibilities that are agreed between the sponsor and the research team, and in the case of us being the sponsor, us and other sites. So ensuring we have up-to-date information, we have this with study details on our database and documents, and we make certain that keeping it as accurate as possible with our database, we're fully compliant with regulations approvals. And this is always an ongoing task. So if you ever have amendments, make sure that we're one of the first to know. That is sort of the shield that we sort of abide by. Now, we sit within a larger team in R&D, and there are sort of many different components to this. So we have a grants team. They advise and support research identifying, preparing grant applications and coordinating funding pools. Project registrations team. So that's when we're alerted to new studies. They get issued an R&D number. They then get allocated to a governance officer or another part of our team if it's a funding application. It can go to a different part. And then we can begin the local setup and reviews. Obviously, research governance, where we provide advice and support in gaining R&D approvals, obtaining non-CTEP sponsorships and applications for ethical approvals. And we have a clinical trials team, and they take on sponsorship for CTEP studies within GOSH, who they also advise on the process and assist with access to the wider network of support at GOSH and ICH. We also assist with putting studies forward to a research adoptions committee. They act like an internal peer review committee that can help review your application. If your study hasn't got any funding and no one else has peer reviewed it, they can assist with that. Finance team, they can provide costings and grant applications for funding reviews for studies and advice on financial arrangements, payment details and terms and conditions within contracts. This also includes budget management, post approvals, invoicing and transferring of funds to the correct departments or support departments. So within R&D and research governance, we'll be liaising with all these teams to get our studies approved. So a study comes in, it's a non-commercial study, there's some funding in the contract. We then liaise with our contracts team, we liaise with our finance team to get it all checked, approved, so we can then move on to the next stage of our reviews. There's also the BRC team, and as you know, they provide infrastructure for research via an NIHR grant, which translates into separate awards, other funding opportunities within our institution. Now, these are all separate teams within the same department, and we have one goal. So we do work like a team, different units, all working towards the same goal. So I'm now going to pass you on to George, who's going to talk about the submission process for your study for any regulatory bodies.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to be talking about how you can best prepare for pre-submission for sponsor studies, how to go through this process as smoothly as possible, and the importance of planning ahead. Before we talk through these slides, I think it's important to differentiate between sponsor studies and hosted studies. You only need to submit to regulatory bodies for studies your site is going to sponsor. For hosted studies, you as a host site will not need to do the submission. You only need to obtain the local approvals from your site, which the sponsor studies will also need. First, Nemo is going to talk about this later in the presentation. For sponsor studies, when it comes to submitting your study to the regulatory bodies, the governance team are going to be your best friends. We've been there, we've done it, we've got the t-shirt. The advice the governance team gives is essential in getting your study through the regulatory bodies the first time without the regulatory bodies sending it back and asking you for lots of changes. So what is it the R&D departments look for from study teams to make this process as smooth as possible? Let's start with completing your IRAS form. It is paramount that you complete all questions in the project filter as accurately as possible to represent your project. Incomplete or inaccurate selections will mean that the data set generated is not appropriate for your research. As you can see on the image on the slide, for a basic science study, there are a number of questions that have not been enabled. Please make sure that you complete all fields in the form, as it can be quite hard to see if any are missing when you. So you can review the form page by page online or create a PDF to draft. The green I buttons on the IRAS website tell you exactly what the question is looking for if you're unsure of the answers. The IRAS form is divided into three main sections. Part A deals with the study as a whole. Part B is legislation specific. There are a number of different sections to deal with, be that tissues, CTIMPs, the Medical Capacity Act, radiation, and information security data. And Part C relates to various sites which the study will be taking place. Because the form has to cater for all types of research, the questions are not always applicable to your project. Try and answer those questions as best you can with as much transparency as possible. It's also important to keep your audience in mind and ensure the form is completed in low language. When it comes to your study documents, you need to have an R&D governance officer review your peer-reviewed documents. If you can provide us with your study documents all at once, it makes it so much easier to review everything in tandem and we can pick up any inconsistencies between the documents. Once we're happy with them, you can upload them to IRAS for submission. So as you can see on this screen grab from IRAS, when you go to submit your study, the IRAS website has a checklist of documents you'll need to form the minimum document set. The checklist provides a list of the documents that are normally expected to support the application. Use this as a guide to the documents you should include, although those marked as mandatory are expected in all cases. Depending on your study type, this will be the protocol, the IRAS form, information sheets, consent forms, the OID, study agreements, and the SOCAP. When you're not including a document that's listed, enter a reason. There may be some additional documents that are not listed for which are applicable to your project. NHS sponsor studies are automatically covered by the NHS indemnity for the design, management, and conduct of the study. However, if the sponsor is not an NHS site, alternate insurance must be found. We would expect all chief investigators to be GCP trained, especially if it is their first research project, and that for a sponsored study, they have a contract with the trust that is acting as a sponsor. We'd highly encourage you to approach R&D earlier rather than later. The review of your study documents before you submit may take several rounds of drafts before we're happy to approve it on IRAS. I myself have personally had studies come to me with the documents and expect to have documents reviewed by me, submitted to the regulatory bodies and approved at the site within a month. That's never ever going to happen. So now you know the essentials for pre-submission. What can you do to make it go through the rec as smoothly as possible? So if we talk about IRAS authorizations, you need to make sure you have electronic authorizations in place for all declarations in the form, and that they are shown as valid. This will be the CI and the sponsor representative as well. And depending on your study type, you might need radiation experts or cortical guardians as well. Please do not add electronic authorizations until you are certain the application is complete. Any changes made will invalidate the IRAS form and any authorizations are already in place. If your form requires multiple authorizations, be aware that if one of the authorizations changes the form before we authorize, all the other authorizations will be invalidated and need to sort again. When you go to submit your application, you must book your application before you electronically submit it. If you do not book the application, it will be rejected and the submission history will show that the submission was invalid as no booking was made. If you change the content of the form or the documents in the checklist after submission, then these changes are not automatically sent, so you need to liaise with the point of contact at the rec. Once you have submitted your application, please ensure that you or somebody else is familiar with the research is available contacted in the days after submission. This will enable quicker resolution of any queries about the application. When you upload documents, please make sure you enter the correct file title, version number, and date, ensuring that this information is consistent across the checklist and the documents. Where footers are used in documents, please check the document information is also consistent. While attendance at a rec meeting is not compulsory, it is strongly recommended to assist with the speed of the review of the application. It is also important that for student studies, students are accompanied by their academic supervisor. Some of the issues the rec may identify along with the HRA assessment queries regarding your application could be resolved if you're present to provide an explanation. Attending a rec meeting may avoid the need for questions to be raised via correspondence following a meeting, which will allow you to receive the outcome quicker. When planning research, it is considered best practice to involve patients and the public in the design of the study, and sometimes also in its conduct. Review by a rec will ask you for evidence of how you have involved patients and public in the design of the project and how it helped. The HRA best practice principles provide practical resources and information about how to get started involving the public. I'm now going to pass you over to my colleague Sanaa, who's going to talk you through local processes once you've received your regulatory approvals.
Thank you, George. Hi, everyone. Lovely to have you here with us. So I will now talk a little bit about what needs to be in place for the actual R&D approval. So this is once the regulatory approvals are received. So this is really all about the feasibility procedure, which is being undertaken by an NHS organization to assess and confirm whether the organization has the resources, policies and service users required to successfully deliver the research study to time and target. So essentially, what this is about is assessing whether or not the trust has the capacity and capability to participate in the study, and then putting any practical arrangements in place to be able to deliver it. And the last step is really about confirming that the organization has that required capacity and capability and will deliver the study. So if we think in terms of the feasibility review, what we, the R&D team, governance team really do is we consider these tasks and activities that are outlined in your research protocol. So what that really means is that we look at patient population, recruitment, trial timelines, any study procedures involved, and most importantly, the level of involvement of human subjects, etc. And this is really with an aim to confirm that the trust can deliver the study safely and effectively, meeting all governance requirements and of course, performance targets. So the R&D team will lead on this stage based upon documentation submitted. And what our review may include is, for example, assessing clinical capacity, confirmations from various supporting departments that are affected by the study, could be your finance sign-off, and chief of service approvals. Just one thing to bear in mind, if your study involves other NHS trusts outside of GOSH, those trusts will have to conduct their own review as well. So, as you might have already gathered, there are a large number of reviews that will be undertaken at each trust, and really depends on each individual study. So I guess the next question you might be asking yourself, what do you need to submit to us? So basically, we need everything submitted for HRA rec approvals, which constitutes as the minimum LIP, local induction pack. And then any additional supporting documentation, for example, your lab manual, delegation login, etc. And this is something that your R&D contact takes you through and can facilitate and help you out with. So the kind of things that we will look at, what my colleagues have already touched upon briefly, is basically checking the costings of the study and to ensure the study is adequately funded. Or maybe if there's a shortfall that has been identified, how can that be met? Just to give you an example, something really simple, like archiving fees are often forgotten in non-commercial trials. So we also ensure that the adequate study contracts are in place and check what staffing is needed. So that could be doctors, nurses, AGPs, data managers, and clinical trial practitioners. And really, it's about making sure that level of expertise required and the relevant training needs are met as well. So as George mentioned, GCP, good clinical practice training, or informed consent training, both available on the NHR Learn. We also contact all the required service supporting departments, such as imaging, clinical trial pharmacy, pathology, medical devices, information governance, and so on. So basically, it's to ensure that all the affected departments, all the relevant clinical directorate and chief of service are aware of the study and are able to accommodate it. And then once all these internal sign-offs are received, it's at that stage basically where the final overarching permission to run the study at a site is granted. And then just to take you to the last piece of the puzzle, obviously the final R&D approval is not where the story stops. You really do have to think in terms of any post-approval processes. So just to bear in mind that you might be audited internally by R&D, or there could be a regular external monitoring visit taking place. Again, depending on the type of the study. So if you were, for example, involved with a CTEM, your study could get inspected even by the MHRA. Another thing to point out is that you need to ensure that you're meeting the conditions of your rec approval. And to achieve that, you're required to complete and submit an annual progress report until the end of your study. At which time you will also be required to complete an end study final report. Of course, you also must report amendments to your study post approval. So if you, for example, need to extend the recruitment period or widen the sample size by, let's say, using different sites or change your principal investigator, etc., you will need to let rec and R&D officers know about this. I guess so this kind of brings us to the last but not the least aspect of the study life cycle. And this is dissemination of research findings. As we know, health and social care research is conducted for the benefit of patients, users, care professionals, and the public in general. Therefore, all those pursuing health and social care research must open the work to critical review through accepted scientific and professional channels. The obvious route to inform the research community is through publication in scientific journals, but there are various dissemination strategies from presentation at local, regional, national meetings, conferences, and then just bear in mind the most important part is informing your research participants and service users of your research findings. I guess this was just, to be fair, scratching the surface. There is so much more to it, but we just wanted to give you a little taster and have included some useful links and recommended reading material if you wish to explore more, from training that's available online for free to get your GCP and any informed consent training, how to go about maneuvering the mysterious iris system. There is really useful e-learning module on iris that we really recommend for everyone to go through. It's very informative and intuitive, and just some other bits in terms of any templates that you can use for your paperwork. And there is a big emphasis in terms of new development that, as we know, PPI is really important around your research piece of work. So far, funders have been super keen to have that shown, in your grant application. But now finally, REC are also focusing on that. So starting December, it's going to be one of the main conditions of your REC approval. So just to bear in mind, that's kind of like coming up in the future. Thank you. I'm just going to get Phil to close us. Thank you.
Okay, so we're based in the Philip Allman wing, second floor in Institute of Child Health. We welcome visitors to come and speak to us about studies, or if you've got any questions. We have a generic email address, so if you haven't actually got a governance officer as a contact for your study, you can email the governance inbox and then they'll disseminate it to one of us who will then get back to you. And there's our website. You'll get this all disseminated. You're going to send out the slides to everyone. So I suppose we're going on to questions now.
Thanks, guys. Yes, does anyone have any questions in the room or online? Was there any in the chat?
There was one in the chat that said, George, can you kindly advise us how we arrange the meetings that you mentioned?
Is that to the REC? Is that?
To the REC, Ruth?
Is this?
Hi, hi George, it's Ruth Garcia. As you know, we're in the middle of trying to submit a protocol for a study, and we just wanted to know, how could we get a meeting? How can we access you? And you mentioned something about REC meetings before, so I don't know if you're talking about the same thing or is it different? Thank you.
So the REC meeting I was talking about is where you book your study in, if it doesn't have REC approval already. Is that what you're talking about?
So we already have the ethics committee approval, but we are struggling with some of the questions, and so I guess, you just told us where your office is. So is it possible to organize a meeting with you so that we can go through what's left over?
Yeah, I think I know what study you're talking about. Yeah, just come find me. It's fine.
And any particular days of the week? I don't know whether you all...
Maybe if you email Ruth.
Yeah, just find me, Ruth.
Okay, thank you.
Every day though.
So I'm not sure if people heard that, but she said that there's normally a governance officer in the office every day of the week, so it's possible to drop by in person and organise that. Any other
Thank you.
questions in the room? I have a couple of basic questions to get right back. You mentioned hosted versus sponsored research. Can you expand on that? What does that mean?
Hosted is where we're not the sponsors. An external commercial company or an external academic site or an external trust are actually leading the study and we're invited to take part. That's hosted, so we're just like taking part in the study as a site. But sponsored is where we're leading the study. The chief investigators here, the funding's here, and we're sort of setting up from scratch and either just running it here at one site, or it's going to be multi-site. So we would then be inviting other sites to take part.
It also means that we have a responsibility for conduct and management of that study, so that's quite key.
Okay.
If we decide to take on sponsorship, it's a huge undertaking, and that needs to be assessed by the team. So we have kind of sponsorship reviews.
Sorry. And then again, sorry, this is just my naivety and stupidity. You mentioned so the IRANS process. I mean, I think most of us will be setting up projects already under existing REC approval. So is there a limit to how many smaller projects can fit within inside that, or I know that there's a review process every number of years, or if you're getting towards the end of your participants, but is there a limit to what can be, how many projects can sit under that umbrella, if that makes sense?
I'm not aware of any limits. It all depends on the regional approval and what actually the sort of other studies will be taking from that study if it's covered. If it's covered, then I think it's unlimited almost.
I guess it's about whether your overarching reg actually, you know, covers the work that you wish to conduct in that next. In terms of timelines, funding provided, and the activities, what is actually in the protocol. So we would be assessing to ensure that it all matches, that you don't have to go any different routes to cover it. So.
But I guess the kind of underlying message is the earlier that you think about whether that fits within it and talk to yourselves, then the smoother the process will be, because you won't be delayed in approvals and stuff.
And also ensuring that your original hasn't actually expired, because we often have the situation where we realize that they're not covered by the original ethics, so they have to put an amendment through for that one first to open up the space.
Neil has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Neil.
No, just to add to the team really. The other thing to also kind of factor in is that if you're, if you're planning on adding additional studies to an existing ethics application, sometimes you have to be careful that you're not veering off too much away from the original application, because I've had instances in the past where ethics have come back and said, actually, it's too far off, and you basically would need to apply for a brand new ethics a brand new ethics approval. So, but again, working with the R&D department, we'd be able to guide you through that and help you if that was the case, or and just take you through that process.
Brilliant, thank you.
Similar point, I suppose, like how broad or how narrow does the application need to be about a specific project? If you're looking at like a broad range of projects, but under a very similar topic, but they're individual projects, can that be covered by, one application? And how broad could that be, or is that?
Depends on your protocol.
Yeah.
What have you included in your protocol? So if your protocol is very broad, obviously, then it could cover a number of projects. It very much depends on what you have in your protocol. And then you have to think about, if you're taking consent, have you included everything in your patient information sheet? Where so that appropriate consent can be undertaken, because then if you're going to add to that, have you got consent for the additional piece of work that you're going to do? So there's lots to think about. Making it broad is not, it's not always the best way, but it very much depends on, the type of project.
Just as a follow-up for that, Patrick, say for instance, if you wanted to add an amendment to essentially broaden that initial scope, that's not necessarily the best way to do it? It would be better to start an entire new application under a separate.
Yeah, it depends if are you asking a different question to the original question?
And I think also, just to add to that, sometimes with amendments, when ethics review them, sometimes they will actually say, you're veering off away from the original question, and it may need additional work on it in order to either keep it in the scope or to potentially submit it as a new study. Having a vague question sometimes can be good, but not always, because then that just leaves it open to a lot of interpretation, and sometimes that then causes further issues down the line. But again, by all means, contact your R&D department, and we can certainly advise around that.
I have a question, which is about the end of the ethics approval, when it's finished. What happened to so if you have a clinical trial, I think you just stop your clinical trial, right? But here we might be in a situation in which we have, for example, taken materials from patients and then transform it into something else. Do we need to stop and we work with the transport material, or we can still work with that?
So it really depends on what was listed in the original ethics application. But generally, if there is scope that you anticipate that you'll be using the additional sample or the leftover samples for other research projects, then there are a number of ways you could deal with that. So either you could transfer that tissue into a biobank until you've got the ethical approval in place. Potentially you could extend the ethics application on the original study in the anticipation of opening up the new study and then transferring it or using it in the new study. So again, there's lots of different avenues you can take around that. But I think if you have things like that, by drop a message to one of the teams and we'll be able to certainly advise the best approach to that, and also whether there's a biobank available to be able to store the tissue.
Thank you.
Another kind of general question for me, Kim. I think a lot of people struggle with, can you explain a little clearer how the structure sits within the general? I know that it's separate because it's GOSH ICH, but within the general UCL structure, how is there crosstalk across that? Is there crosstalk?
So the R&D office is a joint office that provides a service to all researchers across ICH and GOSH, in terms of getting your studies approved. And there's a range of studies that the team has spoken about: CTIMs, observational studies, lab-based studies, and all of those require different types of approval. For example, if it's a lab-based study, the university has specific requirements for conducting lab-based studies. You have to do risk assessments. You have to have certain things in place in order to use certain facilities like confocal microscopy or spectroscopy, whatever. You have to have those approvals in place. You have to have finances in place in order to conduct your study. If you're working with animals, you need to have Home Office license. So those are the university requirements usually for lab-based or non-clinical, if you like, studies. But the office, there's limits to what the office can do because it's primarily employed by GOSH. Staff that work within that office are substantively employed by GOSH, but we do provide, services to the university. But we can't do things like review contracts, for example, on behalf of the university. That has to be done by UCL Research Services. And there's certain other things that we just can't do. We can advise and we can tell you where you need to go to. Some of your projects, if you're not working with the NHS or anything to do with NHS patient samples or tissue or data, but you are working with human participants, you might have to go through UCL ethics to get approval for your study, because you might be doing research within the community or in schools and that kind of thing. So you might need university ethics. So we can advise on those sorts of things, but we don't get involved in university ethics and in terms of what processes they have. We can direct you to the application administrators that you can talk to who can give you advice around the whole process, but we're not embedded in that process to be able to advise further. But, we try and help as much as we can, but there are limits to what we can do.
This might be completely far too difficult, far too much work to do, and I appreciate that there are so many different types of research projects that are going to have to go through this system. But having recently gone through the system myself for something that already had ethics in place, I was relying on other people within our team that had gone through something similar recently to tell me how to do it. And that was quite difficult because then I was taking their time. They couldn't really remember how they did it, and some of the information was incorrect. So I wanted to know if there was anything on the intranet or a pipeline or some kind of information that could tell me step by step what I needed to submit or where I was in the process and what I could expect at the next stage, to then make it a bit easier for researchers doing this to kind of navigate the system. And also would mean less emails sent to you, because I remember sending countless emails saying, where am I, what's next, what do I need to do I need to do anything else, please let me know, this is quite time you know, it's a time limiting factor. What can I do to speed it up? And without knowing where the end stage was or where I was in that process, I just found it quite frustrating. So is something like that already in existence, or could something be set up to help us navigate the system?
Well, we are looking to update the website, so that's where a lot of the information will be. But I think the best way to kind of move your project forward is come and talk to someone who are talk to me. There's a number of people within the team. The three here, Phil, Snella, and George. There's actually two other governance officers as well that are not here today, but they can also help. Then Neil, who's also on the call, is our governance manager, can help. And there are others. We've got two administrators sitting in the audience as well, who can also help you navigate through the study. So I would advise, you know, it's impossible for us to kind of give you individual names at this stage. You know, we try and turn around things. If things go to the mailbox, we try and turn around things within 24 hours. At least, you know, direct you to the appropriate person that can deal with it. But, you know, team of 5, and we're dealing with, you know, 600 odd projects.
Which is why I think having kind of, rather than us kind of coming to see you and say, what about this project, what about this project, we have a central thing you can look at and say, oh, I'm right here on this system, I know what's going to happen next, I know what to expect, rather than coming to see you and taking up time that you possibly don't have because you have so many projects. That's kind of where I was.
I think in an ideal world, we've talked to ourselves about how to kind of like tracker. Again, so we're not filling up your email inboxes with knowing where we are and what bits are missing, and almost like a kind of, you know, a bit like Work Tribe where you can kind of see where things are and people can send messages within that. But I think it's just... We
do have systems, but I think it's giving access to the researchers on those systems, because we do have systems in place where we have workflows which the governance officers use, but that isn't, you know, that isn't something that we can give access to the research. It might be in the future, but not at the moment. But certainly we are looking at updating the website and making it much more useful.
Is there any thoughts to restarting the surgeries, you know, that were done before, because they were great for just dropping in and not spamming people in boxes with 10,000 emails, but being able to just ask someone where something is rather than at a defined time.
Well, we can certainly look at that.
And just to note in general terms, the junior faculty are working on animation to be developed in tandem with the R&D office to kind of give an overview of what the process looks like, so that people coming into it afresh will have a kind of, not step by step, but an overview of what's going on. So hopefully that'll be an easy education. It's been an ongoing process. I mean, one other kind of question is, how many projects are you dealing with across a year? Just so that people have an idea of what the workload is.
So, so on average, the governance officers deal with around 100 studies each. Some have some more, some have slightly less, but on average, that's what we deal with, and that's new studies, and that's not including amendments and things like that. So the team are extremely busy. But can I just comment on the last question as well? You know, I guess one of my roles is to kind of to get out and meet with the researchers and help them with these kind of queries and to help them through the process, because, you know, I appreciate that you don't want to bombard the office with emails, and that's, you know, very grateful, but I think it's important as well on the flip side to also you know, to have guidance around what needs to happen, and so you're not wasting your valuable time in submitting something that you may not need to submit. So I would certainly encourage you to drop an email to the inbox and myself, and I'm always happy to come out and meet with researchers along the way. And also, just to go on around the surgeries, one of the things I introduced at a previous trust was to have these kind of surgeries, because again, you are cutting down on emails, and usually you can deal with the query at that point in time and not letting it drag on. So that will be certainly something that we'll be looking at hopefully in the near future.
Can I just ask a generic question, because I think it's something that affects us all. So what do you guys think would be reasonable for part-time to, I know it's very difficult ethics applications differ a lot. But in order to get new ethics for a research project, what do you think is a reasonable time frame to allow? Because it's taken, it has this, but I've had a couple of experiences in past years where it's taken a very long time for a variety of different reasons. But if we're planning new projects, we're applying for grants and start dates, etc., what do you think is, in your experience, is a reasonable time frame?
I think if you've got a very good protocol, and then you know you can move quite quickly through the whole process.
Yeah.
And then you know but you know protocol isn't the only documentation. It's you do need things like information sheets and consent forms. So you know it's making sure that all of those things are in place, because that whole process of review can take a while. So you know it's really difficult to give a timeline.
Okay.
You know.
Sorry, Matthew, just in terms of animal licensing, what the Home Office have told us is that essentially you need to prepare a year in advance.
Yeah.
So is that what we should be thinking in terms of?
Well,
ethics
certainly if
approval?
you're going to be, you know, embarking on a clinical trial.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of that is around the costings and the finance or the
Yes.
contracts. Yeah.
Yeah.
But even for a the kind of work that a lot of people will be doing here, which might be the kind of basic science but involving human participants, so using human samples.
Yeah.
I think it'd be reasonable to say like kind of at least 6 months.
But also to add on to what Vanshri was saying, I think it's also a two-way communication. So, you know, the team can turn things around quite quickly, but in some instances, we don't hear from researchers for a period of time. And then obviously that will delay the whole process. So I guess the other take-home message is if we can work as a team, like for example, when we request stuff, and likewise when you request stuff, if we can provide that in a timely fashion, that will certainly increase, increase the quickness in getting it to ethics.
I have one other question about, so over the last couple of years, there's been the development of the drive and the DRE systems, and that's all geared towards pseudo-anonymized data. What's the, is there a streamlined process for approvals on that, or is that going through the same systems whereby you need research passports, everything in place before you get access to essentially data which is pseudo-anonymized and you would never know these data? Because I think the big push at the institute to go down the data science route, and that might be one of the kind of hurdles that needs to be overcome, whether there's either a streamlining process in situ or whether that's on the horizon, see if that's possible. Because I think that's going to be more and more applicable as we go forward.
There is a process. I wouldn't say that it's streamlined, because often people tell you that they're working with anonymized data, but actually it's not anonymized, it's pseudo-anonymized, and that falls under GDPR. So then that's where the biggest issues come, because then we do have to put it through the whole kind of ethics route. You can't use the existing kind of overarching ethics that's in place for, you know, secondary use data. You have to go down the whole kind of ethics route. So it's making sure researchers really understand what they mean when they say anonymized.
Good question online. If there are examples of what an appropriate consent form, information sheet, project protocol, etc. needs to include, so that we can tick that off the essentials then before submitting to REC?
In our links, there's consent form templates and there's a protocol template on the HOA website.
One more question. I know the answer to this, to be honest, but is there an extension number for the R&D office?
No,
Is there not?
during the first lockdown, UCL took all our phones away, so we don't have any phones in R&D. I think there's one phone at one desk, that's about it.
So
But you can contact us on Teams.
Teams and Zoom are the best. We don't have
Teams.
work mobiles.
Best way is to contact from Teams.
Teams is like a good alternative.
Message or ring.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, that's all from online.
Any other questions in the room? So I guess the take-home message is prepare early.
Yeah.
Speak as much as you can with the R&D office, and try not to get frustrated with the process, I guess. So if that's all, we can make that. And there's so very few snacks here at the front of the table.
There's
To come
coffee
up and take them.
There should be tea with preference for coffee and snacks outside. So.
Ah,
Cool.
And then just to thank all the
Yeah, thank you,
speakers. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Feedback survey, just take a picture, that'd be great.